So good afternoon. I am Steve Swain, a professor of music here at Dartmouth College and the director of the college's Montgomery Fellows program. Somebody was saying we should have tried to figure out how to do this on the green, but I don't think we have the technology yet to do quite that. The Dartmouth Fellows program brings exceptional people to an exceptional place. That exceptional place, of course, is Dartmouth College, but it is also the Montgomery House on Ockham Pond, which was purchased in 1977 through the generosity of Kenneth Montgomery, class of 1925, and his wife, Harl. Our fellow today, the college's 274th resident fellow, comes to share with us her research and insights about artificial intelligence. In partnership with James E. Dobson, Special Advisor to the Provost for AI, the Montgomery Fellows Program invited 4 exceptional individuals to speak in the series, Agency, Speech, and Ethics in the AI Era. These fellows were selected because we consider their expertise essential to understanding the most pressing problems and opportunities connected with artificial intelligence. We invited computer scientists, historians, legal scholars, and philosophers to help us think about the impacts of these new technologies on our campus, in our research, in our classrooms, and in everyday life. I have asked Jed, the wearer of many hats, to introduce today's speaker. As I've already mentioned, Jed is Special Advisor to the Provost for AI. He is also an Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing and the Director of the Writing Program. He's also a mensch. And one of the he is. And one of the persons on this campus I point to and encourage students and colleagues alike to be more like him. Would you join me in welcoming Jed Dobson?
Thank you, Steve. Tonight's speaker, Orit Halpern, is the final fellow in our series. As a member of the great class of 1994, we're absolutely thrilled to welcome her back to Dartmouth. Professor Halpern is the Lighthouse Professor and Chair of Digital Cultures at TU Dresden, where she conducts research on a variety of topics, including the practices and epistemologies of design and how these impact society in the intellectual history of artificial intelligence and its functions as an epistemology shaping decision-making and an epistemology technique of shaping decision-making and automation. A historian of science, a media studies scholar, a critical theorist of design, Halpern is the author of 2 major field-defining books, Beautiful Data, A History of Vision and Reason since 1945 in 2014, and The Smartness Mandate in 2022 with Robert Mitchell. She's published work in academic journals including Configurations, Technology and Culture, ISIS, and Critical Inquiry. Professor Halpern is the ideal fellow with which to conclude both our series and a year-long project of assessing the role of AI in teaching and research at Dartmouth. We began the year imagining many promising aspects of the Gen AI moment, the new forms of critical inquiry made available by the affordances of content production engines, pedagogical strategies to preserve the best of the liberal arts while our existing forms of assessment have been upended, and the ways in which Gen AI chatbots might keep open the possibility of thinking otherwise and to inculcate uncertainty in their users. We're now ready to think more about how we have arrived at the present cultural and political moment and how these technologies were made to appear novel, urgent, and utterly unavoidable. No one knows this history better than Orit Halpern. She was there many years ahead of the field with her analysis of neural networks in mid-20th century perception. Thoroughly researched, brilliantly argued, elegantly written, her book, Beautiful Data, exposed the network of interlinked changes in observation, communication, and governing. Already in 2014, she provided a critical reading of the artificial neuron described by McCulloch and Pitts, the founding of the field of cognitive science, and the cybernetic paradigm that has had long-lasting influence on the epistemologies of 20th century modernity. Archivally rich, beautiful data is simultaneously dense and expansive. It traces the confluences and influences of key concepts from computer and cognitive science, and at every point along the way demonstrates Halpern's formidable historical analysis and theoretical formulations. Her second book, Smartness Mandate, co-authored with Robert Mitchell, as I said, takes up some of the key ongoing intellectual concerns from the first, but produces new sites of analysis. All things smart, from architecture to cities, from PageRank to population management. Smartness, Halpern Mitchell write, ultimately concerns the promises about computation, complexity, integration, ecology, and crisis. All key terms in our discussions of AI in the present and pressing issues for those of us considering our actions and their consequences in responding to the rapid development and deployment of these technologies. Professor Halpern's lecture tonight is titled Financializing Intelligence, AI, Neoliberal Economics, and Reactionary Politics. Please help me welcome Professor Halpern back to Dartmouth and to the Montgomery Fellowship.
Thank you so much for that extremely generous introduction. I hope I live up to even a small element of it. Oh, wait, I have to turn this on. Oh yeah, okay, right.
Keep on going.
Okay. Thank you all for being here on such a beautiful day. For such a, well, I don't know, it'll be an interesting but probably not such a light foray through the history of our present. I want to thank Jed, Steve, Ellen, all the people who brought me here. It's so generous and it's been amazing, and it's been also great interlocuting with the students and the people at Dartmouth, which is such an intellectually rigorous place, and as we kind of try to think productively about the capacities and problems of not only AI, but more broadly, the future of higher education and the humanities. So thank you all for being here. Anyway, today I'm going to talk about financializing intelligence, and this is work that comes out of my recent book with Rob Mitchell. We just talked, The Smartness Mandate, but it's also part of a new book I'm writing right now about histories of automating decision-making and the reconfiguration of ideas of freedom and its relationship to politics. So stuff that speaks to today. And for a long time now, I've been working on finance. This is an immersive interface, actually first built in '97 when the New York Stock Exchange started imagining how people would interface with finance at kind of at personalized levels. And I think it evokes this idea of both the fact that the market was heavily digitized by then, but at the same time, the imaginaries of the market and the way that this is also about attention politics and attention economies. So in the course of this talk, I'm going to go through a wide range of fields. You're gonna get quite a survey, which kind of indicates my work. We're going to be talking, so I'm going to take you through a vast territory and link it back to contemporary politics and attention economies. So I'm going to link a history of cognitive and neuroscience through the work of Donald Hebb, histories of the development of the neural network. That's a perceptron, first introduced here. So you can have, you're going to have a Dartmouth moment. And then, and the work of Friedrich Hayek, a pioneering, obviously, economic theorist and kind of leader of the Mont Pelerin Society, an idea of neoliberal economics. So we're going to go through neoliberal economic theory, psychology, and artificial intelligence to tell a story about how automated decision-making became a virtue and a mandate, as well as a site of freedom. That's really key. And in doing this, my interest has been to really think about the relationship between our personalized and financialized lives, contemporary alt-right politics and post-truth politics as related to both the epistemology and ideologies that are encoded in our technology. So, you know, all of the kind of correlation between these tech bros and our contemporary political situation, I would argue, has quite an extensive history. But to begin, in 1945, the economist Friedrich Hayek began his battle on behalf of neoliberalism with a call to rethink knowledge. In an essay that looms very large over the history of contemporary conservative and libertarian economic thought, Hayek inaugurated a new concept of the market. The peculiar character of the problem of a rational economic order is determined precisely by the fact that knowledge never exists. The economic problem of society, Hayek argued, is a problem set by data. It is a problem of the utilization of knowledge not given to any one person in its totality, to any of us in its totality. This was no small claim, and by the way, I'm going to try to animate. You know, economists are not always the most stimulating speakers, but anyway, you know, and I guess that's where the chat could have kicked in. I don't know, but anyway, this is a really massive claim, and this seemingly theoretical statement gestures to a grand aspiration, a fervent dream of a new world governed by data. And at the heart of Hayek's conception of this data-rich, or this market as a processor of information, was the idea that no single subject, mind, or central authority has complete knowledge of the world. In short, that people do not have objectivity. We do not have full information. Such proposals might at first seem unintuitive responses to political catastrophe. Hayek was a fierce critic of both fascism and communism. His argument concerning the uses of knowledge was in direct response to what he viewed as a violent political crisis created by democratic populism. His response, however, unlike many thinkers at the time, was to imagine the replacement of human reason through distributed intelligence and the technology of the market. This emerging neoliberal imaginary did not operate in isolation. So Hayek was hardly the only person to say, you know, people aren't such great decision makers. Check it out, Stalin, Hitler, etc. But he was the first to say that the answer wasn't necessarily more reason or stuff like that, but rather distributing intelligence. And I'm going to talk about that. And this wasn't his idea alone, right? As historians of science have noted, the Cold War rationality did not conform to the dictates of Enlightenment reason. The specter of technologically induced planetary destruction through nuclear war, the memory of a global war, so people kind of immersed in these kind of technological environments, created a critique of human decision-making. And this critique fostered the production of a formal, repeatable, and algorithmic model of decision-making, one that perhaps mirrored the emerging new computer technologies of the time. So Lorraine Daston, lots of people have talked about kind of the emergence of this new rationality embodied in people like these game theorists working at RAND, calculating reasonable things like nuclear war. Yes, the fact that they made it possible to think these things is itself a fascinating history. Not part of this, but the one difference I would say between these RAND kind of experts making decisions, if the rational decision maker was still an expert in area studies or science, the intelligence Hayek proposed, I argue, was somewhat different. The rational technocrat was capable of objectivity, planning. You see these guys like planning their launch sites, predicting the future. The subjective and ignorant vigor Hayek provides us with cannot. And almost simultaneously, as Hayek was coming up with this idea of a kind of new, kind of subjective, deeply failed human decision maker, his idea wasn't, like I said, his alone. It was also being repeated by economists, psychologists, and technologists. So Hayek was very informed by the work of Donald Hebb on neural networks, and was also then influenced individuals like Frank Rosenblatt, important for the history of the neural network. So how did we become neural? To start that story, actually, I'm going to start talking about a psychologist. But as we know, psychology and economics throughout history have long had mere ideas. After all, economics has long been obsessed with a unit of who makes a decision, right, and what type of decision maker the individual is. And this obviously has lots of implications and relations to economic thinking and theory. So there's a long history of the links between economics and psychology. But to start with a link here, I'm going to start with another figure that may or may not be familiar to any of you, Donald Olding Hebb, who in 1948 published The Organization of Behavior, which is a really important psych book. And he, to paraphrase his findings, he put forth the famous adage, if you're in AI, that cells or neurons that wire together fire together. So what does that mean? So he was working with people who had been injured in the war, had transformed their capacities, maybe lost hearing, lost a limb, stuff like that. And he realized that people really quickly were compensating for these transformed capacities. And he started to think maybe the brain is neuroplastic, that actually maybe brains can get rewired. Maybe people, they can be trained. And then he tried to think, and then he did lots of experiments on cats and other animals, and also on people, to try to figure out if this was true. And he came up with a theory, and the theory I will demonstrate through my favorite image of a cute AI-generated cat. So the theory goes something like this. If a baby sees a cat, let's say baby sees cat, and maybe some adult says cat when it sees the cat. Now, babies don't know what cats are. We don't tell them the ontology of a cat. The baby just sees cat, hears cat, he sees cat, hears cat, sees lots of cats, hears lots of cats. And then slowly, eventually, as this theory says, a certain set of neurons with certain stimuli start firing together. They network together. So I have a lot of neurons, and so a couple thousand decide that they're going to get together every time they see certain stimuli that come off the cat. And the more they see cats and hear cats, the more they fire together. If this is starting to sound familiar, that's because this is indeed the original model for which neural networks, all of the neural networks, are taken. And so that as the baby sees more cats, the same net will fire each time. So it's getting weighted. It's statistically more likely to fire together the next time it sees a cat, until eventually somehow the baby or the child eventually sees a cat. So the theory, so the more they're triggered together, the more they net together. The more they will trigger together in the future, so they're learning. The net in my head is learning. So this is not a vision. So this memory is about circuits that are statistically determined, and the more pattern triggers, the more it will trigger in the future. It learns. So brains are programmable, just maybe like soon-to-be machines. And so you don't need any representation or knowledge ahead of time. It's just slowly. And this is not like a Freudian brain. Like I don't remember every picture or every image of every person I've ever seen in this theory of the brain. Rather, my neurons literally, upon certain stimuli, regenerate, i.e. regenerate an image or an identification. I suddenly say, okay, I know you, because basically my neurons have been trained. So this idea really got So to give it further currents, in his now very infamous, should I say, sensory deprivation study is illustrative of this new neuroplastic or reprogrammable world. So this is an idea of a brain that can be like programmed, it can learn, right, from the environment. While this research has gained infamy as the progenitor of soft torture in the CIA, not incidentally, the neural network is also the starting of the shock doctrine book by Naomi Klein. You can make of it what you will, but which actually Donald Hebb himself knew and sort of disavowed. But anyway, this research has gained a great infamy, but the interesting thing is that this research was initially done back in the late 50s because it was supposed to examine the monotony of contemporary work environments and their impacts on attention. So the military had noticed that radar operators and other people working in the newly electronic workplace, like these radar operators, were known to suffer extreme boredom, inattention, and depression. So this sort of attentive field was kind of depressing them. So to test the monotony of the modern work environment, 22 male students, volunteers, were recruited to lie in a chamber designed supposedly to induce perceptual isolation. The experimental theory, interestingly enough, correlated the increase of electronic data with sensory deprivation. So interestingly enough, the more information, the less experience you have, is actually the theory, which is kind of interesting to think about. Anyway, we'll talk about this. But anyway, so students were, you can see they were like blindfolded, supposedly everything padded. They were going to lie there. It was going to be, they were paid like $5 a day. These are McGill psychology students, almost all male. Everyone was like, I'm going to lie in bed for a month and be rich, and I'm never going to get up again, and it's going to be wonderful. No one lasted more than 4 days. Almost everyone kind of broke down in like extreme depressive psychotic episodes. And in the meantime, while they were lying there, they also streamed in like little paranormal messages, like little sound stuff. And all these scientists like woke up out of the bed and their outtake interviews and suddenly believed in ghosts and all sorts of things. The study appeared to demonstrate, in fact, a way to impact people's thinking without ever touching their bodies. Therefore, they had actually like mind controlled them, something that was also a very prevalent idea in the 50s in the Cold War. So when adjoined to theories of network cognition and neuroplasticity, it appeared that brains could be remotely programmed from afar. And one journal did a kind of set of illustrations about the outtake interviews, and people were lying there and imagined guys in tubs and spaceships and little squirrels. It's in Canada. Anyway, so this is the kind of stuff that was going through people's heads, and they started imagining and thinking was real and all of this stuff. So Hebb himself labeled this torture and observation that found concrete realization in the CIA's Cold War interrogations, so he immediately stopped on ethical grounds, but the CIA was pretty happy with this and went on and developed a soft torture program off of the neural network hypothesis. So the idea was that the outside environment could actually reprogram and transform your brain. So as the funding sources and reasons for the studies demonstrated, Hebbian notions of network cognition were also a new way to know the world and a new epistemology for an information economy. So interestingly enough, much later, and I don't have the images, people actually within a decade, people shifted this study and went from it being trauma to considering this a standard issue for people in electronic and information societies, and started developing things like immersion tanks, media blackout rooms, and we can think about all the apps now for mediation, mindfulness, all the things that we do to kind of block out actually information or experiences, kind of a mode of self-training. And we have to be thinking about those histories of psychology and how we theorize or think about the human, right, and the subject as kind of co-produced, right, with ideas of computing. But for cyberneticians, psychologists, and soon economists, the idea of an ecologically networked cognition could be a way to reconceive how trauma is dealt with, whether at individual levels or perhaps social scales. So for Hayek, the model for the market was also a model for cognition and mind, culminating in 1952, introduction of the sensory order. In this account, Hayek posits a mind that was linked relationally to the environment, but where perception and cognition were separated in time. And he really loved the idea of Hebb's ideas of neural networks, and he goes around and he says, that's it, that's what our brains are. That's the brain for the market I'm going to fantasize. All right. And he says a bunch of different really interesting things that have implications for our present. So he argues in the sensory order that with that which we are concerned are commonly discussed in psychology under the heading of discrimination. This term is somewhat misleading because it suggests a sort of recognition of physical differences between the events which it discriminates, while we are concerned with a process which creates the distinctions in question. The same is true of most of the other available words which might be used, such as to sort out, to differentiate, or to classify. When situated within history of both statistical thinking and neural networks, this statement becomes really important. And of course, his obsession with discrimination is not maybe a sideline, or rather saying we're no longer concerned with discrimination, we're interested in distinction. So for him, the world is not comprised of clearly discriminating things nor of recognizable things. Rather, there's no subjects and no objects. It's a world of relations whose job, and of processes whose job is to produce discrimination and recognition or distinctions. So the concept of perception and of cognition coming out here through this kind of model is that what is key is that perception is a process that creates distinctions, and the world therefore is not full of pre-existing or already known objects and subjects. So nothing is pre-known until we come into relations with one another. It almost sounds good. To recognize, but also to discriminate, is a process for human beings, one that Hayek insists cannot be known by myself. Until I'm in a relationship with something else, I cannot know what I know, or I cannot recognize things. So minds, therefore, like markets, can never be fully calculated. Only in their physical and environmental conditioning makes individual cognition subjective and limited. So the idea here is always a person, a mind, an agent that enters a network with other things and can only come or develop knowledge inside a network. By deduction, we may then also ask, so the main point here is this is obviously not a type of consciousness of isolated individuals making enlightened decisions, as this kind of picture of like founding fathers making kind of classic liberalism. So there's already an illiberal feature to neoliberalism, right? So this is obviously not this kind of ideal type with all of its problems, but it's also not the idea of calculating reason or rationality or expertise that per se was being forwarded by the Keynesian state and the Cold War kind of expert. Rather, I would say it is an idea that anticipates the concept of network decision-making by markets, an increasingly electronicized one. But we can also ask, of course, how these older histories haunt, right, or continue to animate these new ideas of intelligence. So if everything is subjective and no one really knows the world, what then does this make us think? How do we think about the state? So if there's so much self-organization, everything's a self-organizing network, what about, how do we think about the idea of the state? To which Hayek understands it as only like a library of operations. Like the state's role in his model of both mind and market is one of like an archive. So Hayek says some interesting things about this. He says, for example, that equality of the general rules of law and conduct is the only kind of equality conducive to liberty, and the only equality which we can secure without destroying liberties. So to break that down, Hayek views laws in the sense of a protocol almost, or an algorithm, something decontextualized, a tool that needs to be replicated rather than interpreted, something that maybe we could come to think of in relationship to contemporary movements around constitutionalism and other forms of law favored in reactionary politics. So the state for him is only a repository, or is almost like an operating system. The state's only goal is to offer programming objects to build a market from. Literally, his idea is always about these very regimented, decontextualized protocols that you can enact in order to have the state kind of support this market. And this brings in, of course, many, many other questions. And this is an idea that he often really loved, was the idea that there's no governing body making conscious decisions. As he said, we discover that many of the institutions in which human achievements rest have arisen and are functioning without a designing and directing mind. So all of it is just these learning networks that just learn. And that the spontaneous collaboration of free men often creates things which are greater than their individual minds can ever fully comprehend. So in this account, human institutions are not designed. They emerge, right, just from kind of us in kind of networks. And in fact, while at first he refrained from directly linking analogies between minds and markets, by 1977, he had fully embraced this idea. So the essential point that each member, neuron or buyer or seller, is induced to do this in the total circumstance benefits. So this main point that each of these things, now all of them are the same, neurons are the same as me, as buyers or sellers, is all networked together in a market that is not planned or centralized or even conscious. And the price and market system is in that sense a system of communication. The market can learn. The market can create knowledge, not you. Only all of us networked in kind of these free self-organizing things. So this is a very, very clear implications for our presence. So to summarize just up to here, what has Hayek indeed introduced us? And this is not, and some of this is, of course, people like Philip Murawski have documented this well in relationship to the market. But first, markets are about coordinating information, not matching supply and demand. So this is a new idea of the market, right? As a processor of information, not necessarily as a reflection or refraction of an outside world in a direct way. It's a networked intelligence. The model of learning and using knowledge is grounded in the idea of a networked intelligence embodied in the market. The market is the fundamental type of network that we're thinking here. And it's an environmental type of intelligence. Markets can allow the creation of knowledge outside of and beyond the purview of individual humans. So the market lets me know things that I myself cannot know. It is an intelligence above and beyond individual subjects. So the notion of cognition and decision-making is dispersed into the world and possessed by institutions outside and beyond the human. So I just leave you to think about that. So if markets were machines, what kind of machines would they be then? How can we think about this question of the market? The market, the infamous neoliberal Milton Friedman famously stated, is, and I quote, an engine, not a camera. That is, it doesn't represent the world, it makes one. It makes it. Market theories make worlds. But if it is an engine, what form of machine would it be? And in 1956, a series of computer scientists, psychologists, and related, this is our Dartmouth moment, embarked on a new version. Well, they wanted to break from cybernetics for DARPA funding, but anyway, there's a complicated history. You can ask me about it. Actually, you should ask Jed about it. He knows more than I do. In a proposal for the workshop at Dartmouth College, they labeled this new concept artificial intelligence. And of the many papers presented at this conference, one model aspired not to be about representation, but like the market itself, a machine. That model was the process of learning. It was Frank Rosenblatt's perceptron, and here you see Frank Rosenblatt with a perceptron back in the day when like a neural net like really meant a wire, like, you know, went on or off making a decision. And in the famous paper introducing this idea of what he called the perceptron, he argued a small number, Hebb, Hayek, Eccles, have attempted to integrate specific physiological and psychological information in their theories. They have set descriptive models which suggest possible principles of organization for, yes, statistical learning with layers of nets. All right. Obviously, he was very influenced. I'm not saying there's a direct. I think one of the questions, of course, is what does this influence mean? What is it? How do we think about this history of relations? Now, one of the interesting things about this idea, of course, the idea of the perceptron was basically like the idea of my cat that I showed you earlier, that it works pretty much it was supposed to work the same way. It didn't have enough data. There were other issues, black propagation, but eventually they got it to work, although it took quite a long time. But the fundamental idea of this network was that it worked on information that was collated, right, that it would need a lot of data and it could operate or it could perceive things, right, beyond or outside what just one human being could, right? And that nets learn, right, from so many different data points and coming from different subjects. In theory, right, a net, just like a market, can learn or know things that individuals cannot, since it's a population scale form of knowing, right? So the central tenet of this approach is that fundamentally they can, in principle, be trained, right, on population-level experience. So though each human individual is limited to a specific set of external stimuli to which he or she is, in fact, exposed, the computer perceptron can draw on data that is the result of judgments and experiences of not just one individual, at least in theory, but rather large populations of human individuals. And Rosenblatt said this very often about this being a form of knowledge or learning that is about probability distributions. So I emphasize this kind of relation. So the hope here was that, but the really important hope that we want to think about here is the fact that it was imagined that this form of learning would happen, again, without representation. That you did not have to represent to the net ahead of time what something is. You didn't have to describe it. You could get past this ontological problem that they often had with coding machines at these times of actually having to fully be able to break the world down into an algorithmic set of processes that could be clearly defined. So there's this fantasy. I'm not saying it ever is true or ever happens, but there's kind of a fantasy, right, of learning without having to start with ontologies or clear-cut representations. And this kind of contradictory need to evade representation continues to fuel our desire for unsupervised learning, right? This fantasy of, actionable insights from unstructured data that continues to preoccupy business schools and artificial intelligence researchers eternally. But the key also point here is that in many ways, right, these ideas of networked intelligence in machines reflect and refract growing the ideal of the machine as well in the market. So when situated in relationship to Hayek's ideal of economy as the most and perhaps only route to human freedom, we can now trace a sort of broader ideology that identifies the flow of information as well as the idea of integration into networks as a route to freedom. So how do we think about what we've learned so far? So the idea is here that link or conjoin, even if not intentionally, because I'm not saying Rosenblatt had a particular political, necessarily, agenda in his ideas. But I would say that what seems to link these technologies is a kind of fantasy, again, of overcoming representation, which, as we'll come to, has a lot of implications, right, for democratic governance. And for Hayek, in particular for neoliberal economics, the idea of no planning. If no one can know the future, if no one can direct the network, then no one can plan. Networks have to self-organize. They can't. So we fantasize the automated self-organizing system. So non-conscious or automated decision-making has come in economic thinking to equate with literally freedom. So just to recap, so all attempts, at which point Hayek deduces that all attempts to impose upon a society a deliberately chosen pattern of distribution will literally halt adaptation and learning. It will stop the evolution of the network. It will literally, it's like and increasingly throughout his work, he actually increasingly fell recourse towards biological discourses that are really interesting and important right now to also think about, but I don't have time here. But the key point is that these ideas of networked intelligence and networked markets began to take incredible prevalence and centrality, particularly in the face of the post-civil rights. So this is Brown versus the Board of Education. We'll talk about learning in a moment, but particularly, right, this idea of the self-organizing system took particular force in the course of a kind of post-civil rights society where these seemed like apolitical, technical ways to get past the political impasses or the political, as a kind of politically correct way, I guess, to be conservative or to be against integration. So that's the kind of really critical feature of this. But wait, so now we have the seamless integration. We have from our brains into our markets, everything's great, self-organizing, it's all gonna work perfectly, but there seems to be a few problems. The very features that seem to make these systems evolutionary and emergent were also their terminal point of failure. The stochastic property of nets led unpredictably and potentially to increases in entropy and noise. So for example, very quickly people noticed every single subject, went kind of insane in this study, or at least had a paranoid delusional episode. So in neural network researchers and theoreticians found two remaining and inseparable problems, both related to the integrity of the subject and the residual problem of perception. One concerned excess data. If human brains could be trained, how did human beings maintain their stability in the face of environmental stresses? How did nets know if they're being trained on errors? So like everyone, how do I stay sane if I can constantly be retrained? Like how do we do that? How do we create stability? And how do nets know if they're being trained on errors or manipulated? In short, how do you know if the signal's coming from inside or out within the net and from when? And if a system is always adapting, how does it not mutate to the point of extinction or psychosis? Neural networks researchers, for example, quickly discovered that errors in weighting might propagate and exacerbate in just errors in general and create failures in automated decision making, and might lead to oscillation and instability. So this problem of positive feedback, and what if you're feeding back error, right? Or noise. So neural network researchers only refracted a broader discourse repeated by cyberneticians, political scientists, social scientists, and economies. What if network feedback loops fed the wrong positive feedback, for example, in nuclear confrontations, leading to network instability and by proxy even terminal, in this case, species extinction failure, right? This is a real concern. In the post-war period, economists also obsessed about how to avoid the sort of market failures, shocks if we will, that had led to the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe after the First World War. In fact, Hayek himself was running into a lot of problems because he was like, oh, Britain and the US are going to collapse because of their Keynesianism, but they were doing just fine. So like that trauma didn't happen that all these neoliberal economists wanted. So within the context of the Cold War, such historical memories of market failure like the Great Depression came adjoined with a new concern about the future survival of democratic and capitalist societies. The question was about decision making. Were populations sound decision makers? A history of populist democratic fascism or rabid anti-communism like McCarthy might suggest otherwise. Richard Hofstadter's path-breaking analysis of Senator McCarthy's anti-communism stands out in this regard. The paranoid style, he argued at the time, understands the world as it kind of misreads and overfeeds like patterns of behavior. So it's pattern seeking in the wrong way, resulting in overstating the possibility of prediction or kind of in a paranoid sense that the whole world is actually networked together, but in a kind of conspiracy against the individual. In short, too much data might provide ecological fallacies and false patterns. Today, but this is a serious problem for the neoliberal economists. Like, how do we know if it's the invisible hand or the deep state? I mean, the market's just doing what it is, but like, do we know if it's being manipulated? Like, how do we know? Like, if patterns emerge and things are just organizing, is everything going, so basically, essentially, there's kind of a constant paranoia, if you will, to the entire conception of how do you safeguard your self-organizing networks from being manipulated. And this is kind of part of this sort of paranoid politics. There's a constant fear that like someone is manipulating the market. So, but the irony is the response actually to this kind of paranoia was actually to say, okay, well then we'll just add more machines. Okay, well, we'll add more machines. So Hayek became obsessed with cybernetics, bio, adding more machines. We'll just have more machines, the machines will regulate themselves. The more data we have, the better it'll be great. So if there is no representation, then how do we know what is true? Maybe our machines will tell us. So the idea was if information becomes even freer, if there's more freedom of information, and we can circulate more information, somehow this is going to safeguard our networks. So to recap, what have we got? As Hayek established, individuals are subjective, recognizing the limitations of the powers of individual reason, the inevitable and universal ignorance, and it is the only freedom without coercion that will allow self-organization. So the idea here is we're not conscious decision makers. The only type of freedom isn't necessarily an older form of ideal of liberal sovereignty, but rather a freedom from coercion, whatever that might be. That will allow us to all join together in a market that will self-organize and produces the kind of knowledge and decision-making and direction that previously we thought governments would do. And government's only job is to give you the platform upon which to build your market. And freedom is only equivalent to the absence of conscious decision-making. Now, this is really interesting, I think, is the fact that freedom isn't actually me consciously making decisions. It's actually the fact that I don't need to think about my decisions. So freedom equals non-consciousness equals truth. And if freedom equals non-coerced but reasoned decisions, and if markets equal many free decisions, which are non-conscious but somehow reasoned, then freedom equals market participation, and truth equals market action. So what the market does is sort of kind of what's true, because it's what works. It's enacted in the world. That's kind of the evidence that that was the best decision is made because the market is doing it. Then decision-making at scale is made only by markets that are now networked machines, and we could maybe extrapolate that to other types of networks, social networks, or these other kind of things. And in fact, and therefore, all planning is coercion, so things like affirmative action are actually disruptions to this process of evolution and adaptation, and thus against the self-organizing system and evolution, and certainly even against life and liberty, right? But the interesting thing is, by the 1980s, do these questions of truth and noise and everything else even still matter? Well, this is the interesting one. So to summate, this new concept of intelligence is autopoietic, self-organizing, and cybernetic found itself problem. What would happen if all the messages circulated were false or noise? So what happened to this problem of the system maintaining stability? Well, now we like volatility. So at the height of algorithmic trading and derivative instruments, computer scientists turned financial gurus. So Fisher Black was a student of Marvin Minsky's and actually developed a series of technologies that have produced contemporary finance in some sense. Or I don't want to say there's one guy who created it. There's lots of technologies, but an important set of technologies, along with Myron Scholes. And so one of the creators, the automated derivative market, says something fascinating about this question of how do we know if things are true or stable. And he says, the effects of noise on the world and our views on the world are profound. Noise, in the sense of a large number of small events, is often a causal factor and much more powerful than a small number of large events can be. Noise makes trading in financial markets possible. It's because there's fake information and disinformation and wrong information that we can even make money. Otherwise, I mean, everyone would make the right decision, right? Like, there'd be nothing. And thus allows us to observe prices for financial assets. He does one better. If options are correctly priced in the market, it should not be possible to make sure profits. All right, so we have to have, so in his famous article, Noise Trading, he formalized a new discourse in finance and posits that we trade and profit from misinformation and information overload. By the 1980s, these ideas of network, stochastic, and population-based intelligence. So as a student of artificial intelligence, he was obsessed. He actually formalized this into a technology, the Black-Scholes option pricing model, with Myron Scholes, that is fundamentally at the root in many ways, or one of the roots. But the main idea of this is that it's a random walk. This is my little picture of random walk with sort of a normal distribution. But anyway, the point is it's about this noisy world where you kind of make these decisions grounded on a kind of idea that the world is volatile, that systems aren't stable, and that you can actually arbitrage these noise effects. And not only that, once this equation was released in the late 70s, early 90s, very quickly a rush to computerize, and in fact, this kind of accelerated the computerization, the introduction of automated decision-making, not just the digitization of just the price number, but the actual automation of decision-making in the terms of pricing futures and deciding when to buy or sell rose incredibly, and you see the OTC equity market throughout the 80s. You get systems that actually emerged to hedge risk. You also see the rise of hedge funds. And you see already in 1984 artificial intelligence in financial systems, all grounded in this idea. So we have the introduction of these kind of Bloomberg terminals and the sort of rise of contemporary financial infrastructures. And I find this really interesting that this is the Bloomberg ad for their own terminal. And at the corner, there's like a help. Help me. And you see the old traders like trading by hand, but now we sit behind these things. And of course, these markets have now grown to be about hundreds of times larger than the global GDP. And in fact, when we look at the actual size finance has taken of our economy between 1950 and 2015, you are seeing a massive, at this point, you're seeing the weight of the financial sector is hundreds of times larger than any other part of the sector. And it's also something I'm looking into, very closely correlated because the kind of spending that's going on AI right now. So we're seeing a correlation here, not only in the types of markets that this is producing, but a kind of link here, right, between the models of intelligence and of marketing. But anyway, this is quarterly, quarter expenditure. So we're talking trillions of dollars being spent on developing the infrastructure for large language models and other forms of neural networks and AI. And a lot of that is grounded, right, in speculative capital. It's not like people just have $1 trillion at hand. So the long and short of this, you can make dollars from fake news and noise, but only for some, because along with all those nice trends, here's also a trend showing you the gains of the top dwarf, of course, lower and middle income households, and there's a vast amount of research on this. And in fact, Hayek just loved the idea of automating decision-making. In fact, he thought that the most important thing was to do that. In a quote that he loved to cite from Alfred North Whitehead, Hayek just walked around saying this all the time. This is his key point. It is a profound, erroneous truism that we should cultivate the habit of thinking. Yes, that's wrong. What we are doing, the precise opposite is the case. Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations we can perform without thinking. That's right, the less thought, the better. And to which the neural network, but also calculative technologies like derivative pricing equations, become the ideologies and technologies for finding freedom through non-conscious decision-making and self-organization. These are vehicles to automate decision-making at scale for populations. The neural network adjoined to finance became the ideology and technology by which to automate the problem between self-organization and paranoia, more data, feedbacks, more evolutionary learning systems, more information being free would alleviate the problem of ecological fallacy and technicize the political. So above all, also, we have eliminated right representation. Everything just seems to happen to control and predict populations. So this returns us to our present. And there's obviously profound implications for all of this. If Hayek and Hebb still worried about liberal subjects and objectivity, because I'd say that finance went much further than Hayek would have ever necessarily wanted to, we might ask what concerns animate our contemporary networks. Markets and now reactionary politics seek instability and discrimination, but without diversity. Shock has been normalized to be managed through our electronic networks that ironically appear to have the power to exacerbate fantasies of paranoia in terms of agential patterns. If shock for Naomi Klein was a mechanism to destabilize systems and nations to allow the entry of neoliberal governance, we might extend our observation to recognize that now it's become a tool to maintain existing neoliberal systems and to encourage the growth and proliferation of machine learning networks and algorithmic finance. So, both algorithmic finance and neural networks look for difference, right? They look for differentiation. They look for volatility to arbitrage, essentially, or to learn from. So where does this essentially leave us, right? If today, right, we have now created a situation where from the neural networks to our personal devices to our politics, we've kind of, in some sense, embraced the ideology, in some sense, of the neural network, something that allows the scaling, right, from within our brain to political and economic phrases. Where does this leave us? As cultural theorist Randy Martin has argued, rather than separating itself from social processes of production and reproduction, algorithmic finance actually demonstrates the increased interrelatedness, globalization, and socialization of debt and precarity. So in many ways, right, our networks have made us also more reliant on each other. There's a feature here, right, about the question of our relatedness as being also the only source, right, of change. So by tying together disparate actions and objects into a single bundle of reallocated risk to trade, the new market machines make us more indebted, according to Randy Martin. An indebtedness that sometimes becomes extremely visible at moments of extreme market failure, like in 2008. And so the political and ethical question becomes, how can we activate this new indebtedness, the idea that we're all in networks together learning, in some new way. As many theorists have also developed, right, it is only through our machine systems that we can actually see systems, right, that we can see things beyond and outside ourselves, whether it's climate change or other broad-scale phenomena. In fact, in many ways, I often in the classroom use artificial intelligence as sort of a social diagnostic. It shows us what's normative. It shows us what we've standardized. It shows us what we've, so in many ways, our networks make ourselves visible to ourselves. The question is, how do we politically, ethically, and aesthetically make that visible or move, should we say, to consciousness, a topic that has been essentially excluded within this kind of ideology. There's also the questions, of course, of what forms of financialization. Are there other modes of thinking about automating and dealing with risk and futurity? I don't know, these are examples. I'm skeptical, but I'm looking into this. So these are examples. Houston, after Hurricane Harvey, tried to create a bunch of bond instruments that would raise money linked to questions of damage and historical loss and resilience, like making the city more resilient to future change rather than just property values, which always benefited rich neighborhoods. Swiss Re has actually launched a whole set of underwriting nature products, financial products, which are supposedly create futures markets in ecological positive actions. And then I've also thought about the new forms of collectivity and publics emerging around artificial intelligence. These are the anti-austerity protests in Chile that came out in kind of like late 2018, 2019, that started kind of a new constitutional process. That constitutional process has now failed, but nonetheless, it did create a transformation and a will to create new forms of representation, often these organized, of course, through our social and other networks. So to end, Hayek himself gestured to a particular possibility from within his own thoughts. Markets, he argued, demand difference. From the fact that people are very different, it follows that if we treat them equally, the result must be inequality in their actual position, and that the only way to place them in an equal position would be to treat them differently. Equality, therefore, before the law and material equality are therefore not only different, but are in conflict with each other, and we can achieve either one or the other, but not both at the same time. With these words, he stated the fundamental dilemma of neoliberalism, but maybe also of AI. To be free, we have to be put in relationship to each other. We all have to enter, right, these set of relations and communicative exchanges. But he also wavered. Does liberty denote equal treatment and therefore a generic law, or differential and situated treatment, which might denote planning or, for him, coercion, but maybe not? The response of neoliberal discourse has been to automate this relationship, thus obscuring its social character, and extract value from the differences between humans, which is exactly what these instruments do, while maintaining that such relations emerge evolutionary and thus are non-intentional. But our goal has to be to reconcile these things, that they are not opposed, but rather co-constitutive or productive. We need to not replicate the technological imperative that seeks to standardize all these relations, but rather to think of laws and maybe even computational processes as situated, so that equality and fraternity can be reconciled with ideas of freedom. So might this discourse be disrupted? Recalling the argument that difference is the foundation for freedom or liberty, can we push this neoliberal imaginary somehow into a fold, and becoming less optimistic on this? This tension might be the source of a possible freedom through relations, something that, of course, so much of feminist, critical race, and queer theories have all attempted to excavate, only if they're historically situated. So one of the questions here is about history, and are there ways to contextualize learning in any kind of historical mode? So the fantasies of an archive of processes of differentiation might be mobilized to new ends, mainly to recognize the permeable, political, and situated nature of social orders. The future, I argue, lies less in recognizing what our machines have finally made visible, what has perhaps always been there, mainly the socio-political nature of our seemingly natural thoughts and perceptions, and that all computer systems are programmed and therefore planned. We are also forced to contend with the intentional and therefore changeable nature of how we both think and perceive our world. So thank you.
Bring the microphone. Just raise your hand.
Is this on? Hello. It's very unnerving to hear your voice through these large speakers. But anyway, thank you so much for the talk. That's really a lot to chew on, especially at this late in the term, this late in the day. So I'm really interested in what you were saying about situatedness at the end, being specific and paying attention to situations as a kind of resistance against these automatic processes that are unintentional. So one of the things I was wondering throughout your talk, since I've been thinking a lot about neural networks lately, and it seems as though you're establishing a parallel kind of ways of processing between markets as neural networks and neural networks in artificial intelligence. One of the fantasies we've been looking at in my class on robot stories is the fantasy has always been that as soon as robots become conscious, as soon as AI becomes conscious, it's going to kill us, it's going to attack us. So is there any kind of, in this kind of neoliberal thinking, is there any kind of fantasy about markets becoming conscious or becoming sentient or following their own will? Because there already seems to be that acceptance that the markets will follow their own will from the perspective of the neoliberals, and that is a positive kind of thing. I don't know what kind of question to ask about this, because I don't...
No, I think it's a brilliant question, because the idea of, in general, there's a couple like dystopian, fictions about like environments becoming, or AI environmentally, not just as a robot, which kind of takes a human form, becoming sentient and sort of entering these like murderous environments. Or you see it in like maybe more in eco literatures like Jeff Vandermeer, like where the environment itself becomes responsive, learns from subjects in it, and becomes lethal. It's really interesting. I think one of the issues with neoliberalism is that the theories I have, the early stuff does posit is actually its kind of negative frame, and it's in many ways non-future. Like it is actually amazingly resilient, I think, because of its process focus. And in this sense, there is a similarity to computing. Like, it breaks everything down into like a series of things we should do with no clear idea of what will come out of it, except that we'll become ever freer with the free market. But there's no like utopian endpoint. In that sense, it's a really new type of managing futures. And it really rebounds inside these equations, and I don't know, I know that this is sometimes the hardest part for people to be like, what does black skulls have to do with AI? And it's actually, what it has to do is more about different conceptions of automating decision making. Like, we focus a lot on the LLM and how it writes, but there's this other side of AI, which is about automating human decision making, right? And ultimately, that's what this is supposed to do. It's supposed to automate how you make risks, or help you make risks under conditions where you do not know what's going to happen. And so the interesting question is what is kind of the politics of uncertainty that's going on here, and how do we produce an alternative politics of uncertainty that doesn't necessarily posit, like, I know what's going to happen at the end, but that doesn't mean we have to engage in either market behavior or a negative politics, which we have to go against what exists here. And you see that in Trump, like you see it in our present, right? There's just a negative politics. There's not a vision really for the future except like we'll destroy everything. And in some sense, I think that's the problem, but also something we have to inquire into its possibility of the fact that on one hand, all of these techniques are made to deal with, I mean, this was actually mostly came up around the oil crisis. These were modes of managing fluctuating commodity prices and decolonization and other things all over the world, and having corporations find ways to hedge their futures, i.e. the rise of hedge funds. And they were trying to manage these uncalculatable risks. And so I think what you're getting at is the complex question of producing an imaginary around uncertainty, which we don't have a good politics, and the right has responded by giving us certainty. They will destroy a lot of stuff. Like that's the given. But good question.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I agree, this is a weird experience. I'm in the process of learning about the CyberSyn project in Chile.
Yeah.
And the nationalization of technological development there. And the way that I understand it, it's a very starkly different application of cybernetics to what we're talking about here. It's more about planning and making decisions about distribution for a command economy. So yeah, I guess I'm curious about the continuities in this cybernetics and the cybernetics of Stafford Beer in Chile, as well as the breaks.
That is an excellent question. I have an entire first book on cybernetics, and it has a lot about the alternative visions. I mean, I want to say that's the place where, in some sense, this is like a warning story. This is a story that even my story hasn't happened yet. It's a question about how will we imagine these neural networks, right? And there's so many different ways we could. So go back to our little Hebbian network. Hebb was actually, I guess, historically speaking, a progressive guy. He actually wanted the idea of the neural network to fight biodeterminism and genetic ideas of IQ and race. He was like, no, I'll show you that the environment can change what people learn. I'll show us that we have neuroplastic brains that can be retrained, that there's different types of capacities, that even people who are disabled have capacities that shift. This is an incredibly different understanding I didn't have time in the talk. I was kind of giving you this seamless story. But the truth is, there's no seamlessness in the convergence between these histories. Hebb does not have Hayek's agenda. He has a very different one as a psychologist. And the question for us is like, so can neural networks teach us about being human? Can they offer us different understandings of that? Can they create more expansive understandings? So that's just a small example of the whole story of cybernetics, where there's people who took the fact that, this amazing fact that the world can be seen as a matter of communication. That's also an incredible thing. I can talk to animals. I can suddenly understand that I'm intersubjective, that I can't become me without a relationship to you. Like, there's so many things we could activate there, right? And so the question is, of course, the kind of histories and institutions. So one of the things we don't talk about, and I guess I was trying to hint at, but I talked a lot about yesterday, was that AI is an assemblage of practices, technologies, knowledges, stuff like that. And it happens, and there's a real issue that we keep not wanting to talk about, except, interestingly enough, in the university, which I think maybe is an opportunity, because what's happening in the university is actually highlighting a debate that we're not talking about, which is, what will the institutions be? What kind of governing institutions, what are the institutional, and what are the organizations for this future world where we coexist, right, with these technologies and lots of other things, of course. And so the question there is, would these technologies be totally different if they had been developed in command economies or in democratic socialist societies? Would people have not adjoined the neural network to the idea of the market in this particular fashion, or would they have had even different ideas of markets? Because after all, we can also not forget, like, the capitalism or not, we can talk about economy, and we can talk about what people value, in that. And so I think, to answer your question, yeah, there are. Also, a lot of people have pointed out that this talk is very American. And it is. If I had been talking about Chinese AI, it is happening under a very different organization. Now, is the technology different? Not really, but the ideologies might be, and I don't know enough about it. So I think it's really key to bring in those questions of cyberspace, and to remember there were other alternative ideas about neural networks, like just a world comprised out of information and communication, and even ideas about control, right? Like, we've taken control towards this, like, surveillance capitalism theory, but obviously there's also beneficial ideas of control in terms of progressive state planning or other things. So yeah, I don't know if that answers that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize this conversation,
no.
but I have lots and lots of questions in there, because this talk is really interesting and incredibly dense and difficult. So there are just moments. There was a moment you said, we've embraced the ideology of neural networks. So in comparison to what you just said, like, about the difference between an American talk on AI and a Chinese talk on AI, and that was an ideological difference. I'm wondering what you meant by that statement. We've embraced the ideology of neural networks. What would ideology be? And I know that's a...
Well, I feel like the direction we're taking, or the rhetoric around artificial intelligence, and now, again, I do want to separate the realities of the technology. Like, obviously, a transformer model does not work exactly like, not that finance is not deeply obsessed with applying these technologies and is often a leading edge of these technologies. But there obviously are great differences, and obviously there's real material differences in these things. But I do want to say that, like, the rhetoric we have has been very much the one that views the kind of vision of the neural network as synonymous with the vision of the ever expanding and evolving and growing market, capitalist market, right? It's the only way we've thought about this technology. No one is saying, let's build a public LLM, like let's compete with Google, like let's also have a public one, right? So that it's doable, and even fundable, but people don't. That's not a possible, we don't think that way. Like we absolutely, and I'm not saying we necessarily should, but even in terms of our regulatory discussions, we are not discussing this as a public good or as a thing we need to all have, and also their discourse is fundamentally, ruthlessly about oligarchy. I mean, people have no problems with, or at this point, there's no question around the wealth distribution. I mean, no one's talking about you getting paid for training the AI. So, I mean, in that really material way, whether it's about the labor of it or the resource extraction necessary for the materials and the energy for the server farms or anything. And not only that, I feel part of the reason we've so quickly adopted to social networks and then to AI has been in this frame. So that in that sense, like, we accept the tech bros running our government because better them. I mean, that's the idea, right?
And Dave, if I could just a footnote to that is what I was thinking of when you were talking about situatedness and specificity. Like, I think a way to resist against this would be to pay attention to the specificity of how this kind of ideology has material consequences. Now,
Yeah.
you remember the old, like, Althusserian dictum that ideology has a material existence, right? And so in the case of AI, that material existence takes the form of these data farms that people, like in poor communities in Mississippi, they're trying to invite big tech in to occupy their land where there are no jobs, there's no employment. And so these big tech companies invest billions of dollars in poor rural areas and use all of the water and use all of the electricity and hire maybe 30 or 40 people, and that's it. So it's this ideology is not just it's very intentional on the part of the tech bros, right? Yeah.
There's no regulatory action on it. And actually, a different set of work, I actually one project that just finished was actually looking at energy consumption and the use of reclaim, both toxic landscapes, but also different development. Because that's, if you have a mine or a toxic waste dump, that's like grounds that build a server farm. That's what we're going to do in order to repair.
Right.
Or
Including, Microsoft wants to restart 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, no, they're firing up the nuclear plants. That's happening in Europe too. The level of expenditure is incredible. There's of course tax incentivization. There's all sorts of things going on that are encouraging this. And again, this is happening at the same moment. It's just to agree with you. At the same moment that you're cutting research and non-applied math or something where someone might actually build an algorithm or some sort of thing that would actually reduce the expenditure on these technologies. So we're picking certain solutions and they're going certain ways because of the ideology around growth and the fact, and then the way we're also implementing it is non-redistributive, right? Obviously.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. This is truly fascinating. I was just struck by what you said about no one is developing a public LLM or, the idea of the public good that somehow went out of the window along the way somewhere here, right? And looking at this from a historical perspective, I've been thinking about the history of the telegraph a lot, which is also a network. But as a network came into being through nothing but, just decades of state planning, negotiations. I mean, it was probably the most planned thing in a way that, you can think about, and haphazard, et cetera. And so, and the idea there revolved around the public good in a way. Shouldn't we have this communication infrastructure for public good? And then states realized, oh shoot, this is really expensive. We got to partner up with, private companies, et cetera. So at what point did this, and this will sound shockingly naive as a question, but at what point did we lose this entire history of maybe we should keep the public good in mind when we think about networks?
Absolutely. You see the moment. So this is this is about deregulation of financial markets, and you see the weight of the financial sector in the U.S. economy. And at this point, it's at 500% of the GDP, which is big. Okay. And you see it. I mean, you see it. 1975. I mean, you're seeing it in the 80s, like basically with Reagan. Starting with Nixon, really, you start seeing the shift towards, neoliberal governance and the downgrading of regulation and the basically the state moving out of infrastructure or privatizing infrastructure construction. And then there's been, I'm not an FCC expert. And I'm not, I don't know all the inroads on the AT&T breakup and the telecom. You probably can help me, because actually this is part of this next project. I think I kind of need to know a little bit about that, but I'm just being honest that at this juncture I'm not an expert enough to talk about, this question around net neutrality and these battles over whether internet provision is or is not a public good and a mandate. These things are going on, but just now, Trump. I mean, pretty much the Republicans killed it. I mean, they said no, it's not. It's not a public good. So, it's part of an ideological shift, or maybe just a public ignorance shift in terms of even thinking about it, because the other side of the story, of course, is that all of this technology and everything is all built on government subsidies and construction, and still is. I mean, all these server farms, do not for 1 minute, half it's like federal lands, tax abatements, like there's all sorts of ways to subsidize somebody building infrastructure, right? So there is state planning. Under Biden, there actually was very clear Department of Energy stuff on server farms, for example, like policies. Now, I don't know as much what's going on, but I would say, like, the state is not absent. It's the organization of how it's going about doing it is different, which changes also the politics, because I don't think, people aren't going to vote and saying, do I want a server farm, do I not, whatever. And also, they're not understanding this in terms of public good, but market competition, I guess. I don't know. But so the answer is pretty much here, but yeah.
With that, let's thank our speaker. Thank you.